Hope is a word that we like to throw around a lot at Christmas, especially when we're little kids. Hope is a joyous thing, like, oh, I really hope I get, name your favorite toy here, for Christmas. But as we mature in life, as we gain more life experience, and as we're exposed to the disappointments and the adversity and the difficulties of life, hope becomes bittersweet. Because it is something that requires us to understand that the world is not as it should be, but also that we stand firm in the fact that the world may or will be something other than what we see around us. Nowhere do we see this temptation to despair that is sort of necessary precursor for hope than in the history of Israel and of God's people. I mean, going back into the Old Testament, the very first story after the creation is the story of the fall, of Adam and Eve having one rule that they had to listen to and failing at doing that one thing. We see the story of Abraham, who's been given a promise by God that he'll be the father of many nations, but after a period of time of waiting, he loses his patience with God and decides to take matters into his own hand, having a child by a concubine. We see the story of God calling the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of Abraham out of slavery in Egypt and giving them a covenant on Mount Sinai. And as Moses ascends the mountain to receive the tablets on which God will inscribe the terms of the covenant, the people cast a golden calf and worship that, breaking the covenant that they had just entered into before the metaphorical ink was dry on the contract. We see in the book of Judges how the children of Israel are seduced into the worship of idols by the people in the land, and how they cry out to God, and God sends along a deliverer for them. But every time they do that, it's only a matter of time before they go back to their old ways of being. We see a downbeat assessment of the kings of Israel. Saul started with promise and then eventually became insecure and his rule brittle. David started with promise and he had some problems along the way, but he did finish fairly strongly. And his son Solomon showed tremendous promise as well, but then things started to slide at the end of his reign. And then afterwards, there were good kings, there were bad kings. But there was always a sense that Israel was unable to be faithful in the places where they needed to be faithful to God. There's a theme that runs through the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets. And what it is the prophets saying for God, you guys are a mess. But I will take the initiative to fix the problem. Consider what Isaiah speaks to the people as he's pronouncing that they're going to be going into exile. In Isaiah 11, 1-5, he says, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, and from its roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of knowledge and of fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with a rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be a belt, and faithfulness a sash around his waist. David's line had once showed tremendous promise, but it was buckling under the weight of sin by the time Isaiah was prophesying this. But God was going to do something new, even with this old line that had been shown to be inadequate. The same, of course, could be said for Israel itself, not just for the line of kings. And the same could now be said for the church. Is this naive to say that even though we failed in the past, we can do better now? It would be if it were based on human strength. but it is based on a promise from God. It is guaranteed not by our strength, but by his strength and faithfulness. Hope means that we see the brokenness in this world, yes, but that we believe that that brokenness will not get the last word. Hope is grounded in the unshakable belief that God's faithfulness is bigger than my problems, bigger than my flaws, bigger than my addictions, bigger than my weaknesses, bigger than my anger. It is faith. The writer of Hebrews says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and the assurance in what we do not see. We hold that God is able to bridge the immense chasm between the world as it is and the world as it should be. This kind of hope only becomes apparent in the midst of struggle. The more intractable the problems that we face, the more obvious God's power is shown. And so the greater our hope can be. This was especially true in the lives of the Jews in the period of the exile and what followed up to the time of Jesus. The exile was, obviously, a disaster for the Jewish people. But what followed after it is also a disaster for the Jewish people. At the exile, Jerusalem with its temple were destroyed, and the people were removed from the land that was a part of the promise that God had given to Abraham, a part of their own identity as the people of God. And those people were brought back into the land, but things didn't seem to be right. After all, the prophets had made grandiose promises about what would happen when God's will was finally done. If we continue on from what we were reading in Isaiah, we read this: the wolf will lie down with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That isn't the experience that they're having. Now, Jeremiah had said that the exile would last for 70 years. In fact, if you actually count the years, it's a bit fewer than that. It's between 49 and 61, depending on when you count the beginning of the exile from. But 70 was symbolic. It was his way of saying it's going to be a while. It's going to be a couple of generations. But it's not going to be forever. God brought the people back to the land in fulfillment of the promise that he had given. But the world still seemed as broken as it ever was. And so on that front, it felt to them as if God had failed to keep his promise. After all, they were looking for a king. There was a promise that a descendant of David would be on the throne forever. And they were looking for a temple that was his presence. When the tabernacle was dedicated, God's presence inhabited it in the cloud. When Solomon dedicated the first temple, the cloud came onto that. But when they dedicated the second temple, there was no cloud. It's like they had a party for God, and God never bothered to show up. And so on a certain level, it felt to the people like the exile had never finished. Now, Daniel was one of the exiles who stayed in Babylon after the end of the exile. In fact, he ended up becoming a servant of the Babylonian kings and later of the Persian kings. And during the Persian period, after the children of Israel, or the Jews, had been allowed to return back to their promised land, he says, this isn't as it's supposed to be. What's going on? The exile is supposed to be over. But while the people are back home, this certainly doesn't feel like the end of the exile. And so he prays fervently to God, and God sends an angel to him. And the angel says this in Daniel 2:24, 77s are decreed for the people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. And so Daniel has to grapple with what we like to say today as the now and not yet. That God has given a partial fulfillment of his promise, but that promise has not yet come to its complete fulfillment. When we face these sorts of situations, we have a choice about how to respond. On one hand, we could see it as a case where God is only a little bit faithful. Perhaps God is unable to make good on the promises. He overpromised and underdelivered. He bit off more than he could chew. Or we can see these things as a down payment, a foretaste, a sign of God's faithfulness that points towards a future fulfillment in which God's faithfulness will be fully vindicated. Hope allows us to find encouragement, even though we live in a time when God has acted faithfully, but has not yet brought the world to the place that he has promised he will bring it. The Jews struggled to hold on to hope during difficult times, but they also struggled to understand that they needed to hope in God rather than in a particular outcome. God's promise to Jeremiah and to Daniel had a deeper fulfillment in Jesus. Jesus symbolizes the end of the exile. He is the king from the line of David that they were hoping for. He is the presence of God among his people that they were looking for at the temple. But he isn't recognized as the end of the exile. The Jews have misidentified the problem, and so they've misunderstood the solution. It's not hard to understand how after centuries of foreign oppression, the Jews have seen the primary problem in their lives as political and military. And so their hope has changed from a hope in God to a sort of nationalistic hope. A hope in seeing the Romans crushed before them. But Rome is a symptom rather than the root problem. The root problem is sin. But if God gives the people what they hope for, well, there'll be a new problem along very shortly. In the short term, there's no doubt, it would be deeply satisfying for them to vanquish the Romans and to see them have to depart with their tails between their legs. For people who've lived in the brutality and wanton cruelty of the Roman regime, this undoubtedly is something that they would look forward to. But as soon as Rome is gone, somebody's going to be raised up to take their place. And if God raises up the Jews to take the place of Rome, well, it won't be very long before other people are crying out against the Jews. The problem isn't the particular empire. The problem is human sinfulness, selfishness, self-aggrandizement that always leads to empires. And so the people trust that God will do what they assume must be done. But they should instead be trusting that God knows best. Their hope is misplaced because they misunderstand the way in which they need to be saved. It's only by submitting to God's saving agenda that they will find the full salvation that God desires for them to possess. So, they need to learn how to hold on to hope when it's difficult, and also to trust in God rather than in particular outcomes. We struggle with the same situation. As different as our lives are from post-exilic Jews, those same temptations are present in our lives. We also need to learn how to hold on to hope. The Jews lived with the partial fulfillment of the promise of the end of their exile. The exile ended, but their people had not been fully restored. They had to trust that God would bring that plan to its completion, which he did in Jesus. But Jesus presents us with a similar reality. I don't mean to say anything negative about what Jesus has done. Jesus defeated the power of sin and death on the cross. Jesus revealed who God was to us. Jesus has made a way for us to be reconciled to God, and he has inaugurated God's kingdom. But Jesus has not yet consummated God's kingdom. The new age has dawned, but the sun has not yet risen fully in the sky. This world is still broken. And the church, the people that God has called to represent Jesus into the world, still struggles with faithfulness. There are many Jews that reject the idea that Jesus could be their Messiah precisely because the world still seems so broken. How could the Redeemer have come, they argue, if the world seems so unredeemed? But this is the way that God has often worked, even in their history, making a down payment so that we can grow in our hope and faith, even while things are hard. Paul, writing to the church in Rome, talks about how the world still, in the time of Christ, fails to live up to our expectations, how our hearts break when we see the world around us, but how that this drives us to a deeper hope and faith in God. In Romans 8:22-25, he says, "We know that the whole of creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently." Just as Daniel struggled with the now and not yet, so we also struggle with the now and not yet. We have to ask ourselves, do we doubt God's ability to fully solve the problem, or do we eagerly await its final resolution? Hope requires that we trust in God, despite the pain and the brokenness around us. This process is difficult, but it is a part of how we mature into the new creation that God calls us to be. James, Jesus' brother, writing to the church, says this, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." And many of us live lives of relative ease. And so we see that the world is not as it should be. You turn on the news and you see stories of war and famine and such, but it doesn't touch us on a personal level. And some of us are deeply acquainted with the brokenness of the world, because our lives have been turned upside down by some event in our lives. We have to, but the more that this happens to us, the more we have the capacity to learn how to hope. And so, like the Jews, we learn to hold on to hope when times are hard. And like the Jews, we must learn to hope in God rather than our particular outcomes. Our vision of salvation isn't about being freed from the Romans, but we, practically speaking, also have a stunted view of salvation. Now, if I asked the people in the church what salvation means, they'd probably say something like, through Jesus' death and resurrection, we can be reconciled to God, our sins be forgiven, and that we can enter into God's kingdom and live with him for eternity. And that is true. That is what salvation is. But I don't believe that on a practical level, that's actually the salvation that we are often seeking. When we look at the things that we're praying for, when we look at the things that we hope for, the things that we aspire towards, then we see what salvation really means to us on a practical level. And I think for many of us, the salvation that we aspire to is the good life. The good life meaning things like career success, finding love and having a happy marriage, having happy and healthy kids, having, if not financial prosperity, at least financial stability, enjoying good health. And these are good things. Good gifts from God, but they are gifts that we enjoy here and now. They are temporal gifts. God loves us so much that he wants us to have gifts that we can enjoy for an eternity. Is our hope then that God will give us what we desire, or that he will give us what he desires? Do we understand that when he gives us what he desires, he wants us to have eternal gifts? And that if the temporal gifts that we seek get in the way of our having eternal gifts, God is, in his love, mercifully not giving us the things that we desire that may actually get in the way of having the great blessing that we desire. And so, like the Jews, we may not see God's salvation because we're looking for him to provide our vision of salvation rather than his vision of salvation. And so when we encounter the difficulties, things like financial struggles, high needs kids, difficult people at home, in your family, at church, at work, do we simply see these as signs that God is not at work, that he's not been faithful to us because life is hard? Or do we understand that these are things that God has allowed to happen in our life because his great desire is that we learn to be like Jesus? And trusting him in these sorts of situations is actually how we become like Jesus, how the Spirit transforms us. Doesn't mean that we have to enjoy the difficulty. We won't. But it does mean that we can trust that God is at work even in the hardest things that we face. And so we can find hope in the midst of them. We like to pray, God, take these things away from us. Maybe our prayer should be more like Jesus in the garden. Father, if it's possible, let this cup be taken from me. But not my will, but yours be done. Or in other words, God, I don't like this situation, and if there's any way you can take me out of it, please do, but I know that you're good. And so if you ask me to persist in this, I can trust that you have some redemptive purpose, that it can bring glory to you, or it can shape my life and help me to be free from the power of sin, or it can be a blessing to somebody else. And so, Father, glorify yourself in me, even in my suffering. If we see God's saving hand at work, even in the midst of our difficulties, then this conviction, this hope, will sustain us, even as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death.